Muy buenos días para todos y para todas, apreciados estudiantes. El día de hoy entonces vamos a iniciar con una nueva jornada de esta semana en la que nos está haciendo la visita el profesor Michael Domjan, del cual pues digamos nos sentimos muy honrados en este momento. El espacio que tenemos a continuación entonces va a hablar acerca de la edad de oro del conductismo. De hecho, así se denomina. La edad de oro del conductismo es ahora. Desde la revolución cognitiva se ha venido anunciando la muerte del conductismo y creo que aún están esperando por que eso ocurra, ¿no? Sin embargo, todos nosotros sabemos que las aplicaciones y la comprensión de estos mecanismos de conducta son ampliamente utilizados en el día de hoy. De hecho, los grandes avances, incluso a nivel terapéutico, si hablamos un poco de psicología clínica, derivan en gran medida de la comprensión y el conocimiento de estos principios de aprendizaje y conducta. E incluso me atrevería a decir que muchos psicólogos no conductuales utilizan los principios básicos del aprendizaje, así lo noten o no. Entonces, en el día de hoy, el profesor Michael Domjan nos va a estar acompañando para contarnos un poco acerca del conductismo hoy. Y quiero empezar o darle paso al profesor Michael con una breve reseña, un breve perfil de su palmarés como académico. Michael Domjan ha sido profesor de psicología en la Universidad de Texas en Austin, donde ha enseñado aprendizaje a estudiantes de licenciatura y posgrado desde 1973. Él fue jefe del departamento de psicología y director y fundador del Imaging Research Center entre el 2005 y 2008. El profesor también es conocido por su aproximación funcional al condicionamiento clásico, la cual ha continuado en sus estudios sobre el condicionamiento sexual y el aprendizaje de la aversión al sabor. Su investigación fue seleccionada por los National Institutes of Mental Health para el premio al mérito, así como para el premio del Vellocino de Oro por el senador estadounidense William Proximi. Durante 6 años ha sido editor del Journal of Experimental Psychology, Animal Behavior Process, y recibió el premio G. Stanley Hall de la American Psychological Association. Ha sido también presidente de la Sociedad Pavloviana y también de la División de Neurociencia Conductual y Psicología Comparada de la APA, y hoy es un honor para nosotros tenerlo acá. Sé que incluso muchos de ustedes lo han leído, lo conocen, pero seguramente lo que él tiene para contarnos el día de hoy pues va a ser maravilloso. También nos acompaña el profesor Leonardo Ortega, quien nos va a ayudar en las veces de moderador para la fase de preguntas para esta charla. Así que démosle una cálida bienvenida con fuerte aplauso al doctor Michael Domjan.
Muy buenos días, bienvenidos. Para los que están en streaming, la conferencia va a ser en inglés. Pues aquí tenemos la traducción directa, pero los que están en streaming tienen la posibilidad de prender los subtítulos, entonces para que lo tengan en cuenta. Como lo mencionó Carlos, yo simplemente voy a ser el moderador en la parte de preguntas. Entonces, Mike.
Gracias. And buenos dias. And that's the end of the Spanish that I know. So it's wonderful to see you here. It's wonderful to be here. And I look forward to telling you things that I've been thinking about lately. I was invited here as a prominent expert, and I want to start by telling you that I'm going to try to tell you about things that I don't know very much about. Some of these things are really interesting. I think they're at the cutting edge of psychology and the cutting edge of the new age of behaviorism. but I don't know a great deal about it. So I hope I spark some interest that you might be inclined to follow up on some of these things. So I created this title because it's, the title says that it's the golden age of behaviorism. And if you were to ask anyone knowledgeable about the history of psychology, they would tell you that the golden age of behaviorism was between about 1950 and 1965. And after that, behaviorism kind of faded. And so that's why the title is written. It's the golden age of behaviorism is ... Now, maybe, is the question mark, and then there's the explanation. Yes, it's now. And you might, that's kind of a crazy thing to say, but I hope that by the end of the day, when we finish up about 5 o'clock this afternoon, that I will have convinced you that this is in fact the case. Nobody left at 5 o'clock. You guys are going to stay here till 5 o'clock? I'm not going to be here at 5 o'clock. Okay, so there's going to be 2 parts to this presentation, because I didn't have time to integrate it into just one thing, so we got 2 parts. And so there's part 1 and part 2, and we're going to have an intermission between part 1 and part 2, and there will be dancers coming in to kind of change the mood a little bit. And then Dr. Ortega is going to arrange for the dancers. Okay, so here's kind of the traditional timeline for behaviorism. Behaviorism and conditioning and learning dominated psychology. They defined what psychology was from about 1920 to the mid-1960s. And of course, behaviorism was a term that was given to us by John B. Watson in his book called Behaviorism. And that's in, what was the date of that book? I think it's 1920 something, 1924 or something. So that's where it all started. And very much a part of that was Edward Thorndike, who started in many respects the modern study of psychology in the United States. And he was recognized as for his contributions. Thorndike is, we have a clock here so that we don't go to 5 o'clock, but I can't help myself but tell you a little bit about Thorndike. Thorndike is really a remarkable person. He's an unbelievably remarkable person. He wrote, he did his PhD dissertation on the puzzle box experiments, right? You all know about the puzzle box experiments. That was his PhD dissertation. And we're still talking about the puzzle box experiments in 2024. So if you want to make an important contribution to psychology, try to write a PhD dissertation that people are going to be talking about for over 100 years. I was unable to do that. Nobody talks about my PhD dissertation. I did a lot of experiments. I thought they were really important. Has anybody read any of those experiments? Not even my wife read those experiments, and she's a PhD in psychology from UCLA. Even I haven't read those experiments lately either. Anyway, Thorndike is unbelievable. And he wrote about 35 books. Now imagine writing 35 books at the beginning of the 20th century. They didn't have typewriters, or they did have typewriters, I should say. They didn't have computers. And so he was typing this thing on an old-fashioned typewriter with carbon paper to make a copy of it. And it's impossible to make corrections. That's really, it's very hard to make corrections. So he probably didn't edit his work very much. And he wrote a book. I should quit thinking about things and tend to business. But he wrote a book that I think would be really interesting to write today. The book was called The Psychology Club. And the book was a fictional description of this club of people who get together once a week to talk about psychology and to talk about what's interesting and what's the latest and so forth and so on. And in the process of that, it kind of introduced a lot of interesting topics. Wouldn't that be cool to write a book like that today? I mean, Skinner wrote a book called Walden 2, and Ruben R. Diargo was pretty impressed with that book, and he says, well, if there is Walden 2, maybe there should be a Walden 3. And so Ruben R. Diargo wrote Walden 3. And when I discovered that, I was really disappointed because I wanted to write Walden 3, but he beat me to it, so there you go. Anyway, behaviorism was a big deal early in the 20th century, and how big a deal it was is reflected in the fact that a lot of presidents of the American Psychological Association were major behaviorists. So John B. Watson was president of American Psychological Association in 1915. Robert Yerkes, Margaret Washburn, you may not have heard of her. She was a prominent comparative psychologist. Carl Lashley was 1929. Clark Hall is a major learning theorist, 1936. Guthrie, Hilgard were Maurer. These are all major learning theorists. Donald Hebb, 1960, and Neil Miller, 1961. Anyway, behaviorists ruled the American Psychological Association back in this time. And they kind of got pushed aside by the so-called cognitive revolution. And I have it here as cognitive revolution taking over in 1970s, but it really started in late 60s. And the revolution was that there were new journals created that focused on and that had cognition in the title. New societies were established that focused on cognitive psychology. And there was a reorientation of previous journals and societies. Like the Psychonomic Society is the primary science organization in the United States in the late 60s, 70s, 80s. And it started with a lot of behavioral conditioning, animal learning, comparative kind of things, and then it was gradually taken over by cognitive psychologists, and I quit attending their meetings. I didn't want to hear about it. Anyway, they study other kind of things. But cognition comes to dominate. Experimental psychology, it came to dominate developmental psychology, and for sure, social psychology. Social psychology, we just on 100% cognition. And it also started to take over conditioning and learning. Heaven forbid. So as I mentioned, Psychonomic Society comes to emphasize studies of human memory and cognition, judgment and decision-making, a very cognitive kind of topics, becomes a scholarly society and the name of a new journal. Cognitive science becomes the name of a new journal as well as a new scholarly society. And in comparative cognition, there's the Conference on Comparative Cognition. A new organization was formed, and they have a new journal called Animal Cognition. CO3 is one of the best conferences for comparative psychology every year. Is usually held in Florida. And then traditional old-time journals like Journal of the Experimental Psychology, Animal Behavior Processes, that has changed its name, and now it's called Journal of Experimental Psychology, Animal Learning and Cognition. So cognition is everywhere. It's like ants, you know, you can't get rid of them by stomping them out. They're everywhere. And they even invaded my world. So this is a table of contents of the first edition of my book, The Principles of Learning and Behavior. And you'll notice that chapter 12 is a chapter on cognitive aspects of animal behavior. And this was the first time that animal cognition was treated as a distinct subject in a conditioning and learning book. The second edition, published in 1986, there are now 2 chapters on animal cognition at the end of the book, memory mechanisms. And then I like the title of the last chapter, right? Animal cognition, diverse information processing mechanism. It's like it's just a grab bag of different things that, anyway. And to this day, the textbook continues to have 2 chapters at the end dealing with cognitive things. And beyond that, the cognitive revolution in conditioning and learning is reflected in a focus on the notion of representation in studies of learning. And part of that is this concept of SS learning, which Barbara Skorler highlighted the distinction between stimulus-stimulus learning versus stimulus-response learning. SR learning is actually dates back to Thorndike. Thorndike was the first person to suggest the existence of SR associations. And Rescorler was looking at what he called the contents of Pavlovian learning and explored the notion that Pavlovian learning is not just SR, but there may be instances. In fact, it turns out that the majority of instances of Pavlovian learning involve stimulus-stimulus learning, meaning that the conditioned stimulus becomes associated with the unconditioned stimulus such that if you present the conditioned stimulus, it activates the memory of the unconditioned stimulus. And so SS learning is a way to look at Pavlovian conditioning that has dominated our thinking in a lot of experiments and, on Pavlovian conditioning. And what's critical to realize about SS learning is there's no behavior there, right? I mean, that's what makes it so cognitive. There's no response in SS learning. So the world has gone to hell here. There's a lot of interest in attentional mechanisms in learning. Of course, memory mechanisms, not just as a separate topic in a separate chapter, but memory mechanisms in basic conditioning phenomena. If some of you have had the intellectual fortitude to dig through Ralph Miller's comparator hypothesis, well, that's essentially the integration of memory mechanisms into basic conditioning phenomenon. And then, of course, there's studies of the representation of time, the representation of theory or order, a lot of interesting work on perceptual concept learning and learning of other types of concepts, like the concept of same versus the concept of different. And there was a lot of interest in the late 60s and 70s in whether we could teach language skills to non-human primates. And whether we could teach language skills to other kinds of organisms. One of my favorite examples is this dog in, I think it was South Carolina, there was a Skinnerian psychologist, I forget his name, I'll remember his name in a minute. Anyway, his roommate stayed home and didn't have much to do, and so they decided to teach their dog a vocabulary. So they purchased over 1,000 different objects. And you heard about this experiment? You're nodding your head. Anyway, I guess it's dangerous to nod your head around here. So they have 1,000 different objects. It didn't start out as 1,000. It started out, they just went to the toy store and bought like a dozen different stuffed toys. And one was a small giraffe, and the other was an elephant, and another one was a rat, and so forth. And so they would throw out two of these, and one was the elephant, and the other one was the giraffe. They'd tell the dog, fetch the giraffe. And if the giraffe brought back, there were no giraffes in the room. There was just a stuffed toy of the giraffe. The dog brought back the giraffe, he would get reinforced. And on the next trial, it might be bring back the elephant. And then they'd add a third object, bring back the bear or something. So anyway, they kept going, and they were amazed that they could keep adding objects, and the dog continued to perform well, and they got over 1,000 objects. So they taught this dog 1,000 words. This dog had a bigger vocabulary than my vocabulary in Spanish. Anyway, a very cognitive kind of related kind of. Well, Roddy Rodiger, Henry Rodiger, I should call him by his proper name, Henry Rodiger IV. I wonder what the third, second, and the first Henry Rodiger were. They were not psychologists, but Henry Rodiger IV is a very. How many guys heard about this guy? Have you read any? He's written some marvelous books on memory. He's done books on how contemporary memory research can be used to restructure higher education and classroom learning and so forth. I mean, it's really worth paying attention to Rodiger's work. Is outstanding. And in 2004. He was the president of the Association for Psychological Science, and he wrote a presidential column, rather extensive, very scholarly, on what happened to behaviorism. And 2004, of course, is well into the cognitive revolution, right? And people were everybody was impressed with how behaviorism got squeezed out of psychology. And Rodiger comes back here and says, hey, behaviorism never got squeezed out. It just there were a lot of other things going on, and there's more cognitive research than there is behaviorism. But he specifically pointed out applied behavior analysis as an area in which behaviorism continued to be the basic conceptual framework throughout this cognitive revolution. Well, I'm here to tell you not only did behaviorism survive the cognitive revolution, but it's pushing back on the cognitive revolution in just very surprising ways that I didn't know about just a year ago. But I was invited to give a really important lecture at Konrad Lorenz University, and so I thought, I better get really smart about something, because they're going to think they wasted their invitation getting me down here. So, okay, so here comes part of the pushback. And this is my favorite. This is my very favorite title for an article that appeared in the New York Times. And the article is, "Your brain is not for thinking." You think that's a crazy idea? What do you mean my brain is not for thinking? That's all I do with my brain all day long. Well, it turns out that's not what you do with your brain all day long. Relatively little of your brain is devoted to thinking. Right now, you're thinking, I hope you're thinking, and I bet you're using your brain to do that. But you're doing a whole bunch of other stuff. And your brain is taking care of that without you thinking about it. How many of you are breathing right now? How many of you are keeping your posture up so you don't fall out of your chair? That takes a lot of coordination. How many of you are moving your eyes? How many of you are moving your head? How many of you are scratching your ear, whatever you're doing, nodding your head? That you're not using your brain for thinking, you're using your brain for those other things. And those other things take up about 95% of the job your brain is doing. And who is this crazy person that was brave enough to title an article, "Your Brain is Not for Thinking"? Well, it wasn't a crazy person. It was Lisa Feldman Barrett, who is a highly reputable neuroscientist. This was not a crazy person. This was a mainline psychologist with a strong neuroscience emphasis. And this essay, "Your Brain is Not for Thinking," is part of a book that's called 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. I don't know why the half didn't become number 8, but it's 7.5. I don't know. A marvelous book, not very long, not very complicated. Anybody can read it, and each chapter is devoted to pushing back against common misconceptions about the brain. First one being, your brain is for thinking. Well, no, that's not true. A second one is that the evolution of the brain involved a sort of a reptilian primitive brain that was overlaid by more cortical tissue and more complex forms of cognition. She points out that ain't how evolution of the brain works. We don't have a primitive reptile inside of our brains just because we're humans. There are a whole bunch of other things. So if your brain is not for thinking, then what is it for? Well, as she explains, what it's for is for making predictions about what's going to happen next, so that your body and your physiology and all your physiological systems can be prepared for what happens next. What does that remind you of? Pavlovian conditioning. So the answer to the question, if your brain is not for thinking, what is it for? It's for Pavlovian conditioning, not operant conditioning. It's for predictions. And the basis for our predictions is an association between a cue and some consequence that reliably occurs, so that we can predict that second event. And this line of work is being picked up by very sophisticated neuroscientists. And I knew that my visit here was coming up, and so I said, I better get something really current, hot off the press to share with you. And this is an article that appeared in the magazine Nature, which is about as difficult a journal to get published in as anything. And it's an article about how your brain detects patterns in the everyday. It's essentially how your brain learns to predict things. And it does all of that without conscious thought. So, as it points out here, the human brain is constantly picking up patterns in everyday experience. Neurons in key brain regions combine information of what occurs and when, allowing the brain to pick out these patterns in events as they unfold over time in the environment. that helps the brain predict coming events. So they're studying how the brain does this prediction at the level of individual neurons, and that's so impressive that it warranted publication in Nature, just off the press in September. So if you'd invited me in September, I couldn't have told you this great story. All right, here's my next favorite part. This is really cool. If you guys thought I said some things that are kind of interesting, this is way better than that. So there's been a lot of interest lately among social psychologists and among people interested in health and behavior, and a lot of interest in habits. If you're a health psychologist, mostly what you're trying to work on is to get people to adopt more healthy habits. And so how do you develop habits has become a big issue. And this all came to a head in my world in 2014 when this guy, Charles Duhigg, published a book called The Power of Habit. And Charles Duhigg is a science writer for the New York Times. He's not a scientist. But he picked up on the fact that people are interested in how habits are formed and how to modify habits and so forth. And he thought, hey, there's a best-selling book here. I could become rich writing about this. And what's impressive about Charles Duhigg is he went back to the original psychological experiments that worked on habit learning and tried to understand those and write about them in a way that would be something that the general public could find easy to understand. And he did generally a pretty good job. Being an academic, I checked his references, which he listed in the back, and he would often make a claim and then put an academic reference in the back on the footnote from Journal of Experimental Psychology or something, and often those were inappropriate for the claim that he made. So he looked like he was being very scholarly about this, but he kind of was sloppy. But you can't, I don't blame him for that, because generally he was on the right track. And what was he on the right track about? Well, he pointed out that the fundamental process, the fundamental psychological process that's responsible for the establishment of habits is Thorndike's law of effect. Now, think about this. This is a science writer in 2014 writing a best-selling book for the general public, and the book is based on Thorndike's law of effect. And he got Thorndike's law of effect correct. A lot of people get Thorndike's law of effect wrong. A lot of people think that Thorndike's law of effect is an association between a response and the reinforcer that the response produces. The kitten escapes from the puzzle box to get a piece of fish and associates the opening of the latch with what he has to do to open the latch with the fish. Well, that's not Thorndike's law of effect. Thorndike's law of effect is that if a response produces a reinforcer, that acts backwards in time to establish an SR association. That is an association between the response and the stimuli in the presence of which that response was reinforced. So Thorndike's law of effect focuses on SR learning. And Duhigg pointed it out using a lot of different examples that human habitual behavior is all SR learning. And SR learning, of course, is the foundations of behaviorism. It's the foundations of how we explain behavior without cognition. It's how we attribute behavior to a stimulus that's present just before you make the response, and the stimulus triggers the response, and you don't have to think about it. So SR learning is the foundation of behaviorism, and it's coming back in our studies of human habitual behavior over 100 years after Thorndike's original puzzle box experiments. And it's coming back initially from this popular science writer. And he managed to do this because the science of what constitutes habitual behavior has also moved in this direction. And my favorite story about this is Wendy Wood, who is pictured here. She was recently also president of the Association for Psychological Science, and she started doing, she's basically a social psychologist. Now, if you know anything about social psychologists, they are notorious for explaining things in terms of thinking various things, attitudes and judgments and decisions and whatnot. Wendy Wood is a social psychologist living in a sea of cognitive psychologists. And she starts studying habits, and she decides, hey, this is not cognitive. So Wendy Wood came down on the side of Thorndike and reached the same conclusion that Duhigg did, that human habitual behavior is based on the law of effect. And she also went out, wrote a popular book called Good Habits and Bad Habits, the science of making positive changes that stick. That is the science of creating new habits. Her book didn't sell as much as Duhigg's book. She was probably disappointed in that. But it wasn't written as well either. I mean, it wasn't nearly as entertaining. I read both of them. Though I'm going to tell you about books I haven't read. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so they're both into Thorndike's law of effect. And here's one of the first major articles Wendy Wood wrote with graduate student David Neal, a new look at habits and the habit-goal interface. Now, what's the habit-goal interface? Well, the goal is the reinforcer. And sometimes you're working towards that goal, but most of the time you're not. Most of the time you end up there, but your behavior is driven by an SR association. So they talk about habits emerge from the gradual learning of association between responses and the features of performance context that have historically co-varied with them. So it's essentially a statement of Thorndike's law of effect. And she goes on to, this is from an earlier empirical paper, experimental paper, in which she did a survey, as social psychologists are likely to do. She asked people to periodically record what they were doing. So this is kind of a diary type of data set. Each hour they were asked to record what they're thinking about, what they're doing, and how often they have done this in the past. And they based on these diary reports, they concluded that 40% of behaviors almost every day in the same location occur while you're actually thinking about something else. That is, you do things out of habit while you're thinking about something else, which means that you're not thinking about the habitual response that you're actually performing. So her conclusion is that 40% of what we do habitually without thinking, and 60% has to do with conscious thought. Now, Lisa Feldman would dispute these statistics. She would say that 95% of what you do occurs without conscious thought, and 5% occurs with conscious decisions. And I'll tell you why she gets this inflated view of how much of our behavior is due to thinking and how much is due to habits, is because she's a social psychologist. The first thing to know about, is anybody in the room a social psychologist? Before I insult a social psychologist, I want to make sure that I'm not insulting anybody in the room here. But they don't know how to think about behavior. And so this is how she was, the type of behaviors were noted in diary reports. Schoolwork, they're counting that as one response. Come on, schoolwork is a very complicated series of responses. And if we were to count the number of responses involved in schoolwork, we could get to 50 or 75. Entertainment, news, and information, is that one response? No. Social interaction, is that one response? You can smile at somebody, you can talk to them, you can call them on the phone. There's a lot of different responses. Eating and drinking, hygiene and different and appearance. You know, if you're in applied behavior analysis and you're trying to teach somebody with developmental disabilities, you know, how to brush their teeth or wash their face or basic hygiene and comb their hair and so forth. Those are all different responses, and those brushing your teeth involves a whole series of responses. So she doesn't know how to count behavior. No wonder she didn't get a very high count. Okay, so there are other neuroscientists and other philosophers, of course, who've come around this notion that a lot of what you do occurs without conscious awareness. David Eagleman also he's a prominent neuroscientist who also tried to write a popular book and make a bunch of money. And in 2011, in his book, he says, there is a looming chasm between what your brain knows and what your mind is capable of accessing. So your mind is not capable of accessing or getting access to a lot of what your brain is doing. Daniel Wagner is also a social psychologist, wrote a book titled The Illusion of Conscious Will. The notion that you have conscious awareness and will is an illusion. Weirs and Stacy say the problem often is not that substance abusers don't understand that the disadvantages of continued substance use outweigh the advantages. Rather, they have difficulty resisting their automatically triggered impulses to use their substance of abuse. So this conception of habitual behavior being divorced from cognition is giving us a powerful way of thinking about the problems of drug abuse. And by analogy, the problems of unhealthful behaviors in a variety of respects. You know, you stick a plate of cookies in front of me, and I'm not thinking, but I'm going to start eating a cookie. And eating one cookie is great, but who can eat just one cookie? And then you start to get into a problem. A lot of health habits that are deleterious are habitual, that you do even though you intend not to do it. Somebody's trying to stop smoking, has every intention of not lighting up a cigarette, and then they light it up anyway. William James knew this a little bit earlier in his book in 1890 called Habit. He actually wrote a book about habits in which he talked about how people act out of habit without any consciously formed purpose or, and this is really interesting, or anticipation of results. Anticipation of results is the goal. And he's describing Thorndike's law of effect. It's not that the response occurs because it's reinforced. The response occurs because it's associated with an antecedent stimulus, irrespective of the goal. And William James had an insight about that back in 1890. Not bad, eh? Okay, so, well, let's skip over this one. Let's talk about one area in which cognition plays a major role. Of course, is language, which then makes it interesting to think about cognitions that can occur without language. So I wanted to impress you with how much effort I went through to prepare for this lecture. And so you will recognize this as the plaza in Bogota, right? Any of you seen this before? And imagine that you are the person at the end of that arrow, and that your friend has brought you into the plaza while your eyes were closed. That he says, oh, I'm going to take you somewhere I don't want you to look. And he walks you into the middle of the plaza. And, whoops, sorry, I keep thinking I have a pointer, but I don't. So he walks you into the middle of the plaza, and you're over here, and you open your eyes. How long do you suppose it's going to take you to realize exactly where you are, and whether that place is safe or dangerous, whether it's close to home or far away from home, whether it's among a lot of people you know or among a bunch of... How long it's going to take you to realize all of that complex information? You're going to know immediately. You open your eyes and boom, you know exactly where you are. You know who you're with. You know that those things on the ground are not going to come and peck your face, and all of that complex information. Well, that is cognition without language. That's a lot of information that language had nothing to do with that. Isn't that impressive? I didn't make this up. I read about this. Some smart person, unlike me, pointed out, and I adopted the example for Bogota. And if somebody invites me to Bangladesh, I'll pick a different example. No, I won't. I'm not going to go to Bangladesh. It's too damn far. So here's another one that just blew my mind. And this is also 2024 out of Nature magazine. And the title of the article, Language is Primarily a Tool for Communication Rather Than Thought. Pretty interesting proposition, right? Language is not for thinking. And that's a fairly radical idea. Plato said that thought is a silent inner conversation of the soul with itself. That if you're thinking, you're kind of talking to yourself. And language then becomes a critical part of thinking. Chomsky, you all heard of Plato, right? He's been dead a long time. He's not going to come and give this lecture. You can offer as many honorary degrees to him as you want. He ain't coming up. But Chomsky, how many of you heard about Chomsky? Well, he's a big anti-Skinnerian specialist in language. He's a linguist. And he made the claim that if there is a severe deficit in language, there will be a severe deficit in thought. Again, linking language to thinking. Well, this particular claim that if there is a deficit in language, it's going to impair your thinking, Chomsky's wrong about. So this article that, whoa, what happened? Could we go back to the widescreen thing? So this particular article looked at the literature, previously published studies that involved a lot of brain scans and scans of what areas of the brain are activated under various circumstances. And they summarized all of that research in these 3 diagrams. Thank you. And the diagram on the left identifies parts of the brain that are involved in language and that support language skills. The middle, the blue spots on the brain here, support functions like executive function, novel problem solving, math, some forms of reasoning, computer code comprehension. So there are various cognitive tasks involved in the multiple demand network. And what we usually refer to as cognition fits in the middle. And what you see is that the parts of the brain that are doing the things that we usually characterize as involving thinking are not the same as the ones that are involved in language. And the most higher order cognitive function that you could have is called metacognition, or theory of mind. And the parts of the brain, and there's been a lot of interest in metacognition, and neuroscientists have identified parts of the brain that do metacognition. And those parts of the brain are not show much overlap with the fundamental cognitive tasks shown in the middle. So cognition doesn't use the same brain areas as language does, which I think is really revolutionary. I mean, that's big news. And there is other evidence against Chomsky's claim that if you mess up language, you mess up thinking. Ain't so. That's not true. Dissociation of language and thought, and this comes from the same article I've been reviewing here. Various forms of aphasia, where you lose language skills, don't result in a loss of reasoning. Pre-verbal infants in various non-human animal species exhibit complex cognition, but they don't have verbal behavior. They don't have language. There's a lot of research on complex cognition in corvids, a particular category of birds, food-caching birds, elephants, and none of those guys have language. And last category, there are various diseases that mess up your cognition, that disrupt cognition, but they don't disrupt language. So it goes kind of both ways. Schizophrenics are able to talk. It's just they don't make much sense when they do. So language is not disrupted, but thinking is. Down syndrome, another case of that, Alzheimer's disease, and dementia are other diseases in which language is disrupted, but not thinking. Okay. So I've convinced you that language and thought are unrelated, and that you can do a lot of thinking without language. This is another really interesting new perspective on the relationship between cognition and behavior, and it's written by Barbara Tversky, who was married to David Kahneman, who got the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on decision-making and so on. And Barbara Tversky is also a prominent psychologist. I was going to say cognitive psychologist. But in this book, she becomes an anti-cognitive psychologist. And her argument is that motion in space is a universal experience, and it's motion in space that is the foundation of thought. Action in space came long before language, as did thought based on action in space. So it's behavioral interactions with the world in space. And these behavioral interactions are as simple as walking. We all walk, and it's a behavior, right? And it's a highly organized behavior. right? Because I'm putting one step in front of the other, and it's organized so that my body is moved to a predictable location. It's not random motion. It's not random foot thing. It's linear. It's linear, and it gets you from place one to place two. And she goes through examples in this book where a lot of thinking is very linear in exactly that same way. So the behavioral interaction with the environment creates this framework for how you think about the world, so that when you think about other things, like how close you are to other members of your family or to your friends, that social closeness is an important concept, and it's an important part of human experience. That's linearly organized exactly the way that your spatial location in space is organized. And we think about that's a distant relative. Well, distant in what sense? Well, distant as a term that's borrowed from locomotion. You know, your friend is a distant relative because it's further away, and you know what that means because you know it takes longer to get there. So this behavioral interaction is what's actually creating a framework for how we think about the world. So it's not that cognition explains behavior, it's behavior that's explaining cognition. And that's Tversky's main point here. It's behavior that's driving cognition, not the other way around. And here are some examples that she talks about. Babies discover what is a part of them and what is a part of other people, or what's a part of the crib they're in. And they do this not by thinking about it, by interacting with it. They pull their toes, they pull their foot, and they try to stick their foot in their ear or their mouth, and they form a conception of how that foot belongs to them based on these behavioral interactions. They learn object permanence. Yeah, there's a big cognitive concept in infant development. Yeah, I know that the chair is over here and that I can probably sit in it. But if I turn around, I can't see the chair anymore. So I have to have a conceptual representation of the chair in order to be able to back up. And you notice I checked to see if the chair was still there, because I know Leonardo was going to pull it out from under me. But backing into a chair is a complex cognitive task. How do infants achieve that skill? With their behavior, by checking to see if the chair is still there after they've turned around. It's behavior that's shaping cognition. I think it's way cool. And this is the study that's actually illustrating neural mechanisms of this kind of thing. Let me tell you about another book that I haven't completely read or understood. But here is a new book, 2023, by Robert Sapolsky. How many of you heard about Robert Sapolsky? You should all read. Robert Sapolsky is an anthropologist and a master writer. He's written about stress. A famous book of his is Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Have you heard about that one? Well, jot it down. It's worth reading. Why do zebras don't get ulcers? His latest one is called Determined, and it describes a ton of research, over 500 pages, neuroscience research, illustrating that behavior occurs without free will. It's not free will. It's not your willingness to engage in a behavior that causes the behavior. It's not the cognition. 500 pages of argument. And around at the same time I was reading this thing, I was reading a book by Kurt Vonnegut called Slaughterhouse-Five, which is one of the major pieces of English literature in the 20th century. And he had a quotation in here that I thought, wow, this is perfect. If I had not spent so much time studying earthlings, said the Tralfamadorian, I guess this is an extraterrestrial mythical creature. If he hadn't spent so much time with people on Earth, he wouldn't have any idea what was meant by the term free will. I have visited 31 inhabited planets in the universe, and I have studied reports on 100 more. And only on Earth is there any talk of free will. He's kind of saying, we are really out of touch with the universe if we maintain that we have free will. We're about at an hour, and how about we take a minute to stretch, and we'll pick it up in 5 minutes, okay? And if you thought this was interesting, you ain't seen nothing yet.
Before you go, there is something that you need to know, Dr. Domjan. National University of Colombia gave a honorary degree to Chomsky.
To Chomsky?
Konrad Lorenz is giving an honorary degree to you. I think that we got a point.
That's funny.
Ok, nos vemos en 5 minutos, 5 minutos de descanso. Para quienes desean, al final de la charla nos vamos a tomar una foto de todos los que están, entonces podemos subir aquí. Y también pueden hablar los que alcancemos con él. Entonces vamos a terminar la charla, unos minutos para preguntas. Por favor, sean precisos en las preguntas, pero todas las preguntas son bienvenidas, pero no vamos a alcanzar todas. Entonces, tengan en cuenta eso. Muy bien.
Thank you for coming back, and I'm back too. And I've found that I brought too many slides, so we'll move through some of this a little bit more faster. Okay, let's move on to sort of the second half. The second half has to do with what is the relationship, of behavioral output to the environmental stimuli that trigger the behavior, and of course, the brain structures and circuits that mediate that reaction. And I've put on the board here what I've called the traditional behavioral output model. The traditional way of thinking about the relationship between the brain and behavior is that you have an environmental stimulus that activates processes in the brain, and those processes generate the behavior. This is a fairly common way of looking at things. Just to illustrate that I didn't make this up without any evidence, this is the neural circuitry of aggression in response to an olfactory stimulus in rodents on the left side, and the neural circuitry of aggression in primates in response to visual and auditory social cues. And so you basically have the environmental stimulus, which is detected by sense organs, that information going to various brain areas, and final behavioral output is on the bottom, some form of aggression. Now, if you want to be a little bit more sophisticated about this, you'd want to add hormonal mechanisms and genetic mechanisms that influence how brain structures actually operate, okay? And so this is the traditional behavioral output model augmented or expanded to illustrate hormonal and genetic mechanisms. Aggression is a big one, of course, where hormones play a major role, and those hormones influence brain structures and brain circuitry, as illustrated here. Genetic mechanisms, of course, also influence the brain, and genetics actually is the blueprint for how the brain gets wired up originally. So this is sort of an augmented version of the traditional behavioral output model. Now, what I want to convince you of, and I realize I may have been standing in the way of the slides. Could you see the slide okay? What I want to convince you of is that behavior is not just the output of all of these things. It's not just the output of brain structures and circuits. It's not the output of genetic mechanisms, hormonal mechanisms, stimulus mechanisms, but actually behavioral mechanisms determine how all these other things work. So it turns out that behavior actually determines how the brain is wired up. Depending on what you're doing, it changes the brain circuitry. Behavior also controls hormonal mechanisms, and finally, behavior controls genetic mechanisms. So here is an area of inquiry, a large area of research, showing that behavior actually reorganizes the brain. And this is research on how to rehabilitate functions after brain damage. If you have a stroke or an accident, part of your brain is destroyed, that function is not lost forever. If you undergo the proper behavioral rehabilitation training, you can rewire the brain and regain some of that function. And these are 10 different general rules for how behavior alters brain plasticity. First of all, you have to engage in behavior, otherwise the brain mechanism associated with that is going to wither. Use it or lose it. Use it and improve it, and this is the big one. The more you use a particular behavioral routine, the more the brain gets rewired to allow you to perform that routine. And there are a bunch of various other things. This is a huge area of research. Related to this general notion that behavior can rewire the brain, there has been a lot of interest in how musical training rewires the brain. This is an early piece of evidence about that appeared in Science in 1995, which looked at the size of the sensory motor cortex, how much of the cortex is devoted to sensory motor functions in musicians as a function of how many years they've been practicing. And the lower, it's the age of inception. Okay, the higher the score, the more cortical surface is devoted to sensory motor function in these individuals. And you get higher scores with musicians that start their musical training at an earlier age, which means that by the time these data are collected, they have been engaged in musical practice for a longer period of time. And so the general proposition is that the longer you engage in musical practice, the more your brain starts looking different from the brain of non-musicians. The brain of controls is over here. This is perhaps an easier way to look at things. This is also data on musicians versus non-musicians, and this is a different form of neuroimaging in which we're looking at how thick the cortex is. The cortex is the surface of the brain, and it's the cortex that has the cell bodies and the dendrites. And so it has the parts of the neurons that are involved mostly in interacting with other neurons. And so the thicker the cortex, the more coordination you can achieve between different brain areas. And the darker the color on these in these renditions, the thicker the cortex is in musicians versus non-musicians, and the right hemisphere shown on the left side and the left hemisphere shown on the right side. But it's the same general proposition that musical practice can rewire the brain. And this shows a more recent summary of brain changes in musicians versus non-musicians from Frontiers in Neuroscience in 2021. We don't have time to go through all of this, but one of the huge differences that you get in musicians versus non-musicians is the thickness and the size of the corpus callosum. You've got the right hemisphere with this you got a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere, and the corpus callosum connects the two. Okay, it's an interior structure, and the corpus callosum is thicker in musicians. Now, why do you suppose that is? Because you can't play a musical instrument with one hand. If you played a violin or certainly the piano, you've got two hands going. And furthermore, what each hand is doing has to be exquisitely coordinated with what the other hand is doing. So one hand is controlled by one hemisphere, the other hand is controlled by the other hemisphere. For you to get that coordination, the communication between the two hemispheres has to be much more extensive, and that's why the corpus callosum gets bigger in people with musical training. So another way in which the brain, behavior is rewiring the brain. This is another example involving juggling. People who learn to juggle have changes in their brain as a function of that training. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that behavior actually determines how the brain is wired up. This next series of slides should tell you how behavior actually determines the level of hormones that your body secretes. And this is a study of testosterone in fans that are watching a sporting event. And some of those fans, their team wins. And for some of the other fans, the team loses. Before the game, they have similar levels of testosterone. After the game, the winners, their testosterone shoots way up, and the losers kind of lose it. So behavioral experience, in this case, people watching a sporting event. Here you have Portuguese women's soccer players, but I bet the Colombian women's soccer players probably show the same effect. But it shows the level of testosterone on a match day. Again, winners versus losers. And on a match day, the winners, these are at the actual athletes who end up winning the game, and their hormone levels shoot up as a consequence of that behavior. These are hormone levels involving sexual hormones, the luteinizing hormones secreted by the pituitary, testosterone secreted by the testes, as a function of Pavlovian conditioning using a sexual conditioning paradigm in rats. And you've got groups that receive an olfactory stimulus followed by access to a female partner. And these are various control groups. And after this odor has become associated with a female, the males show a hormonal reaction to the odor. So a behavioral task is eliciting luteinizing hormone secretions from the pituitary, which are involved in a sequence of hormonal cascade that involved in sexual response, and of course testosterone. Okay. So I hope I've convinced you here that behavior is not just the output of brain structures and circuits, but behavior can actually influence how those brain structures and circuits are organized. And behavior is not only an output of hormonal mechanisms, but it's an input that determines how those hormonal mechanisms operate. Now let's move on to the next one, is how behavior can actually influence genetic mechanisms. This one is pretty heavy. This one is perhaps the most complicated and the one that I know the least about. And the first thing to understand about genetic mechanisms is that they operate on different time scales. We usually think about genetics in terms of evolution, and you inherit genes from your parents and so on, and you pass along genes to your offsprings. Well, that's the long-term change. That's the third category. Long-term changes in genetics across generations. And behavior does influence that. That is in the research we've done showing that behavior does influence the genetics of the offspring. But there are also interesting short-term genetic responses that are called, these are rapid responses that occur within an hour of a behavioral episode. A behavioral episode will trigger the activation of what are called immediate early genes. And that occurs within an hour. And then there is an intermediate response that takes a little bit longer to develop, where RNA is then used to generate new protein and protein synthesis. And this is one of the coolest graphs that I wish I'd seen years ago. And it's the genomic action potential. Any of you heard about a genomic action potential? Oh, no, you didn't. Nobody's heard. I didn't hear about it until I started to look into this and found this beautiful diagram. So what the genetic action, we all know about a neural action potential, right? Neural action potential, a change in the voltage of a neuron, the inside with respect to the outside of the neuron, and that creates the neural impulse, which then travels along an axon and so forth. So we know about the neural action potential. Well, there is a corresponding genetic action potential, which operates on a much slower time scale, on the time scale of hours. And when you have genes in an RNA, that they don't do anything. They have to be activated. And the activation of those genes is called the immediate early genes, which then produce and turn the DNA into RNA. And that RNA action potential is the one that is the first one to occur. And then as the RNA is build up, then it starts to generate new proteins, which then generate other effects. So behavior actually produces these genetic effects. The diagram I just showed you is taken from this article in Science magazine, where they say that the genome was once thought to be a relatively passive blueprint guiding organismal development. Recent results show that genomes, in fact, remain highly responsive throughout life, and they're responsive to a variety of stimuli associated with social behavior. Social information can lead to changes in the brain and behavior through effects on the genome. And the conclusion is that it is now clear that responses to social stimuli can be massive and involve hundreds and thousands of genes and perhaps many different brain regions at once. And these are the behavioral tasks that have been studied to develop this genomic action potential. And they involve studies in birds, in fish, in foraging honeybees, fruit flies, and so on. So the story is that there's genetic variability which produces RNA and proteins which affect brain cells and cause social behavior. That's kind of the traditional way of thinking about the interaction between genetics and behavior. A new way of thinking about it is that social information and social interaction creates neural transduction, which then affects the genome, resulting in a genomic response and modification, which then in turn alters brain and behavior. So behavior is actually driving the genetic response. Okay. So these are, whoops. We've been talking about the first and second of these types of behavioral-driven genetic changes. Long-term changes are some of the things that we have studied in a paradigm that's illustrated here, where we do sexual conditioning, in which a male bird receives a signal that he will get access to a female, and so it's this conditioned stimulus activates memory of the female. The question is, does that conditioned stimulus influence how many offspring are produced as a result of a sexual interaction? And to answer that question, you have to collect the eggs that the female lays after a sexual interaction, and then check to see if they're fertilized. And if the copulatory episode occurred after a Pavlovian signal, a lot more of the eggs that she produces are fertilized. And you can actually influence which sperm are effective in fertilizing those eggs. And so this was a study of Pavlovian conditioning and sperm competition, in which birds got a chance to copulate following a Pavlovian signal. And then we did a test in which a female copulated with two males in succession, 15 minutes apart. One of those males received the Pavlovian signal, the other one did not. And then we collected the eggs and determined how many of them were fertilized, and determined which male fertilized each egg using a DNA fingerprinting analysis. And the answer was that of the fertilized eggs, the vast majority were fertilized by the male that received the Pavlovian signal. So, and this mechanism tells you that a basic behavioral process can determine what DNA gets passed along from one generation to the next. So a basic behavioral process can, through this kind of mechanism, influence genetic transmission and thereby evolutionary processes. So I hope this quick review convinces you that behavior can actually modulate and govern genetic mechanisms. Okay, so let's talk about the last of these arrows. How can behavior affect the stimulus that you're reacting to? That's kind of crazy. I mean, in the original input-output model, the stimulus is what we start with, and we end up with behavior. This next line of work I'm going to tell you about indicates that the stimuli that you're reacting to are actually the products of the behavior that you engage in. And this actually came from a social psychologist originally, Sam Gosling, who published a book called Snoop, What Your Stuff Says About You. What he did a bunch of experiments, collected a lot of data to indicate something that we all, once I tell you this result, you know it's obviously true. We create the environments in which we live. We create the stimuli that we respond to. Those of you who are looking at your phones are creating a stimulus that you're reacting to. Those of you who are not looking at your phones don't have access to that stimulus. So it's your behavior that's determining the stimulus that you respond to. And this turns out to be a personality variable. Some people are very orderly. You can look at the home screen of different individuals. Some home screens are chaotic, have all kinds of stuff all over it. and others are very nicely organized. And those people are reacting to different things when they turn on their computer. Well, that's how their behavior is determining the stimulus input. So, and this occurs not just in people. This is a study in bioscience in 2022 in which was concerned about, and this is actually a field of ecology now, that addresses the question, how do individualized niches arise? Well, what's involved in creating a niche? It turns out it's the choices and behavior of the species that's involved. Okay, so we started out with this so-called traditional behavioral output-input model, augmented by hormonal and genetic mechanisms. We want to indicate how up-to-date we are with things, and you think maybe that's the best diagram we have of brain behavior interactions. Well, I think this is the diagram that you ought to have about brain behavior interactions. Behavior is not just the output of brain structures, hormonal mechanisms, genetic mechanisms, or input stimuli. Behavior determines all of those major variables. So behavior is at the center of the universe. And we started out by asking the question, is this the golden age of behaviorism? And the answer is definitely. And we get to that answer with modern research in neuroscience and social psychology and in genetics and so forth. And that's my story. Thank you very much.
Two questions?
Oh, we're at 1:44. So.
Yeah,
All right, what are you going?
Ok, entonces tenemos tiempo para dos preguntas, un par de preguntas. ¿Quién quiere? ¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta?
And, you know, I'll be here the rest of the day. We can do photographs, whatever you like, or other questions that we don't have a chance to address here. So. And I'll be here tomorrow.
Bueno, buenos días. Doctor Domjan, tengo una pregunta con respecto a cuál crees que sea la próxima aproximación a la que se llegará en la psicología. ¿Un avance en lo que ahora se está trabajando de sistemas conductuales o un avance en la idea de inducción y covarianza de la ley generalizada de Baum?
What do you think is going to be the next major advance in psychology? Either behavior systems approaches or approaches more based on the law of effect?
Between the two, it's an easy choice. I mean, it has to be behavior systems. The law of effect is just too primitive. I mean, the law of effect is remarkably powerful, and it's remarkable that it remains useful to this day and age. But it doesn't have the richness and complexity that a behavior systems approach has. So if you want to know the whole story, you're going to have to go to a behavior systems kind of strategy. Matching law is definitely involved. And actually, economic approaches to behavioral choice are remarkably powerful and useful. But one of the big issues in the study of operant choice has to do with the availability of substitutes. That is, a particular individual can obtain alternatives that are not programmed, that are not programmed by the experimenter, and this is I think is a huge issue in applied behavior analysis. And the way you understand those alternatives, I think, behavior systems provide some insight for that. Yeah.
¿Una pregunta más? ¿Alguien más?
Una pregunta más básica, ¿substitución de estímulo o subrogación de estímulo? Pensemos en el experimento de estas aves, del comportamiento copulatorio. Hay una reacción, miden una hormona que se da ante la señal condicional. Esa reacción hormonal se da después de la cópula, durante la cópula, es decir, la respuesta condicional se sustituye, el estímulo que evoca la respuesta condicional, ¿provee una sustitución o una subrogación? Bueno, para decirlo así rápidamente, ¿la respuesta incondicional es igual a la respuesta condicional?
So, in the explanation between the relationship between stimuli, which is going to have more emphasis? Stimuli substitution or stimuli surrogation? What is going to be more important in the explanation?
An explanation of like Pavlovian conditioning? I think stimulus substitution is far too limiting. We have to go far beyond stimulus substitution. It works some of the time, but most of the time it doesn't work. So you have to have, again, sort of a behavior systems approach is much better than just a simple stimulus substitution approach.
Listo, muy bien, muchas gracias nuevamente. Vamos a terminar hoy con una foto de todos los que quieran subir aquí. Entonces, los que quieran subir aquí para la foto, invitados. We're going to take a picture.